Is professor of political science at IUPUI. He was educated at University College in London, Rhodes University, South Africa, and he got his PhD from Indiana University. He's author of numerous articles and books, including textbooks. Full disclosure, I was one of his students. And one of the books was Comparative Government and Politics. It's now in its 11th edition. I got to read one of the earlier editions many years ago, and it was a joy to read, even though it was a textbook. Very well done. He's been visiting professor at universities in the UK, Belgium, Germany, and Spain. And he's been recipient of numerous awards, both locally and internationally, including the Jean Monnet Chair in European Union Politics from 2010 to 2013. And he's also the organizer and founder of the annual Midwest Model European Union beginning in 1993. And, you know, he's still active in that. And I couldn't imagine anyone else who could be any better to talk about the European Union and Brexit. So welcome, Dr. John McCormick.
Thank you very much, Claire. Thank you, Betty. It's nice to be back. I mean, I'm looking at the snow outside and I'm completely thrown by what season we're in, but I'm also a little bit thrown by the fact that we're still talking about Brexit almost 5 years after the vote happened. So apparently it's a topic of never-ending interest. So what I plan to do is, if I can get the slides to work here, there we go. It's going to be some background on the European Union, background on the Brexit vote itself. And then I sort of like to look forward as far as possible, even though speculation can be quite dangerous. It's very difficult to know where Brexit is going to lead us, but we'll see. I thought Brexit was never going to happen. So, you know, who am I to speculate? So in terms of the European Union, just some quick background on it to clarify some of the things that I mentioned in the chapter in the readings. The EU has been around in one form or another since 1952. It began as a very modest experiment in cooperation on coal and steel called the European Coal and Steel Community. Only 6 countries joined, so that was West Germany as it was then, Italy, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. Then 1958, they decided to do something a little bit more ambitious and they created the European Economic Community, the same 6 countries. And the goal behind the EEC, or the community as it eventually came to be known, was to try and develop a single market for Europe. In other words, a market within which there would be free movement of people and money and goods and services across European borders. And the major goal was to try and promote peace in Europe. If you could summarize it all in one sentence, that's really what it was all about. In the 1970s and 1980s, 6 more countries joined. The UK was one of those in 1973. It joined that year along with Ireland and Denmark. And a little bit later, Greece, Portugal, and Spain all joined. In 1992, a new agreement was signed among the existing members of the community, which sort of morphed the community into what eventually became known as the European Union, which is where we are now, approximately. And the goal of the European Union was not significantly different. It was still to build a single market and all of the associated things that came with a single market. In 1999, they had probably the most ambitious project they've ever undertaken, which is the launch of the single currency, the euro, which some people have argued that was too ambitious and too soon. But it's had its problems, as you would expect from any group of independent countries that come together and voluntarily give up their national currencies and come together with a single currency. So it's had some problems, but it's also brought a number of advantages to the members of the Eurozone. 2004, there was another expansion, and this was particularly significant because it brought in Eastern European countries for the first time. So places like Poland and Hungary and the Czech Republic. became members of the EU. And then in 2013, the last new member to join was Croatia, taking the total membership up to 28. Then in 2016, we had the Brexit referendum, which surprised almost everybody, including the British government at the time, which assumed that British people would vote to stay in the EU, and a little bit shocked when they didn't. And as a result of that, the UK finally became the first country to leave the European Union, which happened on January the 31st of last year. So membership now has actually gone down for the first time from 28 to 27. There was actually a departure back in the 1980s when Greenland left, but Greenland is part of Denmark and has an unusual association with Denmark. So the voters of Greenland voted to leave. So they left, but Denmark as a country remained with the EU. So in terms of what the European Union is, it's unusual. It's unique, literally. There's nothing else like it. It's an international organization, but it's much more than an international organization. It's not the same thing as, say, the United Nations or the World Trade Organization, for example. So it involves much more of a higher level of integration among its members, but it is not a United States of Europe. There are some people that would like it to be a United States of Europe, but there's also a lot of people who would absolutely not like it to be in the United States of Europe. So it's somewhere more than a standard international organization, but less than a new country. It has common institutions, which in many ways look like a European Union government, but they're not really government. They're a system of governance instead. So they have a European Parliament, which is directly elected. They have a European Court of Justice, which is the functional equivalent of the US Supreme Court. And they have a number of other institutions, a lot of specialized agencies, one of which has been in the news a lot recently is the European Medicines Agency, which is the EU equivalent of the Food and Drug Administration. And I think just today made a decision about whether I've forgotten which vaccine it is, the one vaccine they were having trouble with in Europe, whether it was in fact safe or not, and they decided it was safe. So the Europeans have a common market, an open market, at least the 27 countries do. So if you're a citizen of one of these member states, then you're free to move, more or less free to move among the other countries and to live in these different countries. There are some limitations. It's not quite as free as the movement among the 50 states of the United States, for example. There's a common trade policy, which means that when the 27 countries are negotiating, say with the United States or China on trade, they don't negotiate as 27. They have agreed a common trade policy, and they will negotiate as one, which gives them obviously much more influence and power than if they were all negotiating separately. There's a common agricultural policy, which has been very expensive and controversial over the years. There are shared policies on foreign policy. There is no actual European Union foreign policy as such, but the countries do cooperate, and they do tend to have common positions on foreign policy. There are shared education policies, and there's a whole variety of other areas in which the 27 countries cooperate. The euro is used in 19 countries, and the plans are that most of the rest of the EU countries will eventually adopt the euro. There is no European Union military, and talk of developing one has been quite controversial. There are some people that think it might be a good idea, and again, others that don't think it would be a good idea. There is no European Union tax, so that's one area where the EU institutions really start to look quite different from standard governmental institutions. And then, of course, they have the flag, which is right there. It's 12 gold stars on a blue background. The 12 gold stars have absolutely no symbolism at all. They represent absolutely nothing. It's just a design that a committee came up with and said, oh, that's a nice design, so let's just go with that. And since then, people have been speculating about what do these 12 gold stars represent? And I can absolutely assure you they represent nothing, nothing at all. I always think of the EU flag as a little bit like the Indiana flag, with some of the bits and pieces taken out in the middle. So this is the map of the EU as it was back in 2016. So you can see the UK is still there. So the dark blue countries are the full members of the European Union. You can see that Norway and Iceland are not, and nor is Switzerland. Switzerland is sort of the hole in the donut. They're completely surrounded now by the EU. And then there are a number of countries that have been recognized as official candidate countries, which means they've applied for membership, and it's been agreed in principle that they could join, provided agreement is reached on the terms of membership. So some of these light blue countries down here, Serbia, Montenegro, Albania, Macedonia, for example, and of course the big one, which is Turkey, which has been trying to become a member since the 1960s, but has always been discouraged by the rest of the community or the European Union for a variety of reasons. One of the concerns that the rest of the EU had about Turkey was the human rights record and the political record in Turkey, which of course now is getting worse since President Erdogan has decided to take Turkey in a completely different direction, away from becoming more and more of a democracy. So just to update the map very quickly, we can scrub out the UK, no longer, sadly, a member of the European Union. So I should be perfectly blunt here and say that I think Brexit was a terrible idea. I'm not going to be in the slightest bit objective here. I know that we professors sometimes are expected to be as objective as possible, but I'm not going to be here. I think it was a terrible, terrible idea. I also didn't think it was going to happen. I'm still very sad 5 years later that it did happen. I'm a British citizen, but I'm also a US citizen, so I'm a dual citizen. And one of the effects that it had on me personally was that once the EU left, I lost the right to move to the other, or to live in, or to travel freely in those other 27 countries. So my passport now gets me to the UK, and then if I want to go to other parts of the EU, it becomes a little bit more complicated. So multiple reasons why I think that Brexit was a bad idea. Number one was that a lot of people took part in that Brexit referendum and voted without really understanding what the European Union was, or how it worked, or even what they were really voting on. So the vote itself was deeply flawed in many ways. It was also based on a lot of misconceptions. I'm going to give you an example shortly of one of the major misconceptions that was broadcast at the time of the Leave campaign. There was also for a long time a habit in Britain, particularly, of blaming the European Union for problems that were not the fault of the European Union, which was a part of this problem where people didn't really understand what the EU did. Since Brexit, Britain has lost a lot of its reputation for stability and pragmatism. Britain has gone through this process of great instability since 2016. And Britain, for a long time, had a reputation as a cooperative actor in international affairs and a promoter of the idea of international cooperation. And this really sort of sent the message that a lot of people in Britain were not as much in favor of the typical position on foreign policy that Britain had had for many, many years. Now that it's no longer a member, Britain will no longer be able to shape European Union law or policy, which means that it has to react to what the other 27 countries say, instead of actually being sitting around the table in the meeting rooms where those policies and laws are designed. The UK still has access to the European Union single market, but as an outsider rather than as an insider, which means that it doesn't get all the benefits of being a full member of the European market. The European Union itself has lost a major economic and political partner. Obviously, Britain and the rest of the EU are going to continue to trade and invest in one another, but it's not the same thing as having this considerable country as part of the club. It just reduces your influence in the world. Britain is now smaller and less influential. The population of 60 million people. The population of the EU as a whole was 500 million people. So Britain is reduced in terms of its capacity to negotiate with other parts of the world. It's less attractive to foreign investors. A lot of investment flowed into the UK. A lot of businesses were started there, factories were built because the UK was part of the European Union. That is no longer the case. Outside the EU, Britain has to reach its own trade deals. It can no longer negotiate trade deals with the other 27. And now it has to go through the process of actually renegotiating all of the trade deals of which it became a member as a result of being part of the European Union, which is going to be a long, time-consuming process. And then London is one of the major financial centers in the world. And in part, that was made possible by the fact that London was part of the European Union, and that is no longer the case. So it is not as attractive as it was as a financial center, and we'll have to wait and see exactly what effect that has on the UK broadly and on London specifically. So in terms of the Brexit vote and where it came from, there had been growing concerns about membership of the EU within Britain. Back in the 1990s, there were lots of concerns about what EU membership meant. And then once they went through this process of signing this new agreement that converted the European community into the European Union, people were worried about, what the word union meant and what this meant for loss of sovereignty. The British have always been much more resistant to the European Union than many other countries in the EU. The British have always felt themselves as, different and distinctive and exceptional, if you like. And then you had this problem where, as I said earlier, a lot of people just simply didn't understand how the EU worked. And under those circumstances, they were ready and available to be misled about exactly what membership of the EU meant. So the Conservative Party, the Conservative government was in power at the time, and it had been split. The Conservatives are roughly the same as the Republicans in this country. There are two major, well, there's several parties in Britain, but the two big parties are the Conservatives, which are like the Republicans, and Labour, who are more like the Democrats. So the Conservative Party, which ironically actually took Britain into the community back in 1973, they had become increasingly split within themselves with pro-Europeans and anti-Europeans. And by the 2014-2015, the split had become so substantial that the Prime Minister at that time, David Cameron, felt that unless something was done, that the party was going to split completely, and that would be the end of the Conservative Party as we know it. So what he did in the end was to decide, well, we can't agree amongst ourselves, so let's put it to a vote. Let's have a referendum. Let's ask people what they think. So that's what he went ahead and did. And he was totally convinced that he would win. Like a lot of people, he just felt, how can Britain possibly want to leave? It just doesn't make any sense in so many different ways. So he made almost no effort to campaign. At the same time, the movement to leave, the Leave campaign, they misrepresented in many different ways the costs of membership. So on the one hand, you have the government who set up the referendum not making an effort to campaign for Britain to stay. And then you have this campaign on the outside wanting Britain to leave and making all sorts of false claims about what membership of the EU meant. So it was really a very unfortunate combination. Also, what happened at the actual vote itself in June 2016 was that a lot of people used it as a protest vote. They really weren't voting on membership of the EU. They were voting on the Cameron government. And they were voting on the government in general. There had been economic austerity measures in place since the global financial crisis. And a lot of people resented that. They were hurt by that economic austerity. There was a lot of concerns in Britain about immigration, immigration from other parts of the EU, but also immigration from outside the European Union. And then generally there was a kind of a reaction against the political elite in Britain, against a professional political class. And so a lot of people took this opportunity, who were fed up with the system, to use this referendum as an opportunity to vote not on the European Union, but on what they thought about the situation in Britain at that time. So here's the most infamous example of a misrepresentation that the Leave campaign promoted. And this one is actually mentioned in the article. So this bus was set up and painted with this banner on the side and was sent around the country as part of the Leave campaign. So what it says is that we send the European Union £350 million a week, which the implication is that's a ridiculous amount of money. Let's leave the European Union and instead use that money to fund the National Health Service. So this was a very emotional and emotive appeal, assuming it was correct, which it was not at all. In fact, if you look at the amount of money that Britain was paying into the European Union, and then the amount it was getting back in investments from the European Union, the net amount paid in was actually half what was advertised on the side of the bus. So it wasn't 350 million pounds, it was 173 million pounds per week, which at that time translated into $260 million a week, which is very, very little. In fact, it worked out to about 54 cents per person per day. You cannot even buy a cup of coffee for 54 cents. So this is not an expensive proposition that we're talking about here. And then of course, the biggest irony of all is that since Britain has left the EU, none of that money has gone into the National Health Service. So all of those savings that were promised and those investments into the National Health Service, none of them happened. And the amount itself was inflated to begin with. So this is just one of many examples, and I could give you slide after slide after slide showing you misinformation that went around at the time of the Brexit campaign. So the result was 52% to leave and 48% to stay, which, as I said, was a shock. It was a shock to David Cameron, and it was a shock to almost anybody else. There were a few people predicted it. I mean, there's always going to be somebody that predicts an outcome of something correctly, but the vast majority of people felt this couldn't possibly happen. And I certainly felt it couldn't happen. One thing I will say is that the day after the Brexit vote, when I woke up and heard the result, my immediate thought was, well, Donald Trump is going to be the next president of the United States. So I predicted Donald Trump 6 months in advance or 5 months in advance. And the reason why I'm so sure of that is because I felt that many of the reasons why people voted for Brexit were also similar to the kinds of reasons that people voted for Donald Trump. So Cameron resigned as Prime Minister, and he was replaced by Theresa May. The way that the parliamentary system works is that in order to be Prime Minister, you have to be leader of the party with the biggest number of seats in Parliament. If your party already has the biggest number of seats and you leave as leader and Prime Minister, then your party elects a new leader who immediately becomes the Prime Minister. So that's what happened with Theresa May. She then tried very, very hard to get an agreement on the terms of Brexit and ultimately failed. She made a huge mistake in 2017 when she called a new election early, which is, you can do that in the parliamentary system. Normally there's a 5-year gap between elections, but under certain circumstances, the government can decide to call an election early, which she did. She looked at the polls and she saw that her party was doing very well, so she thought she'd capitalize on it. And it turned out to be an absolutely disastrous campaign for her. And the opposition Labour Party did much better than people thought it would. And so she actually lost most of her majority. So she was in a weaker position after the June 2017 election than before. And things just got worse and worse and worse. And in June of 2019, she finally resigned, stepped down as leader of the party and as prime minister. And what happened, as always happens, was that the Conservative Party had an election for a new leader. And this is the gentleman they got, Boris Johnson. And I should be quite honest and also admit to you that I absolutely cannot stand Boris Johnson. I have absolutely no time for him at all. He's a political opportunist of absolutely the worst kind. He's not a competent prime minister. He used to be a supporter of the European Union, but then he decided he was going to completely change sides during the Brexit campaign, and he became one of the leaders of the Leave campaign. So another election was held in December 2019, which he did extremely well at. He trounced the opposition and he built a much stronger position than was the case before. And then, of course, he had to deal with COVID, and things have all got much more complicated as a result of that. So just looking at some quick numbers, this is a map which is in the reading, but this version is a little bit more detailed. This shows you how different counties within the UK voted, and also the difference between Scotland, England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And what you can see very clearly from here is that Scotland is entirely blue. So Scotland voted 62% to stay and 38% to leave. So overwhelming defeat for the Leave campaign. Whereas in England, it was 53% leave, 47% stay, which is more like the numbers for the UK as a whole. And then over here in Northern Ireland, you see a number of blue areas. Northern Ireland voted 56% to stay, 44% to leave. And then down here in London, you can see quite a few blue areas. London overwhelmingly voted 60-40 to stay. So you can see here that the UK very split. England predominantly wanted to leave, Wales to some extent also, but almost everybody else voted to stay. A couple of other interesting bits of data. This one on the left essentially shows that better educated people tended to vote to stay, less educated people tended to vote to leave. And you can, I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions from that, but there was a pretty clear link there between levels of education and attitudes towards the European Union. And then this one over here on the right, what this shows is that the older population very much voted to leave, whereas younger people over here very much voted to stay. So there was an age difference and there was an education difference. And there were a number of other differences as well, but these were two of the big ones in terms of breaking down how the vote went. Okay, so looking ahead, where do we go from here? Well, honestly, at this point, it's very difficult to say because of COVID. Everything is up in the air. Who knows how long it's going to be before we get out of this pandemic. After the pandemic is over, a lot of things will have changed anyway. But what the implications will be for the European Union, which has done a pretty poor job actually at responding to COVID. They really miscalculated the number of vaccines that were needed, which is why vaccination rates in the EU are significantly behind where they should be. It's unsettled politics in every country. It's unsettled political leadership in every country. It's unsettled economies in every country. So it's very difficult to know what's going to happen moving forward. But one thing that was already becoming clear before the pandemic broke was that Brexit had become something of a warning to other member states of the EU who looked at how complicated it was and how difficult it was for Britain to come to an agreement with the rest of the EU on the terms of leaving. And the result of this was that public opinion polls found that the EU is actually becoming more popular in other parts of the European Union. People are beginning to realize, the benefits and also the difficulties of leaving. So there were some movements. People started talking about, Frexits and Grexits and all sorts of other variations on those themes. So people talking about France perhaps leaving at some point and Greece perhaps leaving at some point. Just to throw some more numbers at you here, just to compare the United States and the European Union 27. In terms of population, the EU is significantly bigger than the United States. They've got about 450 million people compared to our 328. In terms of population, the EU is quite a lot smaller. If you've traveled to Europe, it's much more crowded. Many more people live on a smaller area of land. In terms of the size of the economies, before Brexit, the US economy and the European Union economy were approximately the same size as measured by gross domestic product. But you can see now one of the effects of Britain leaving is that the EU economy has become smaller. And meanwhile, the United States economy has been doing fairly well in the last few years, except for obviously last year when it was terrible. But overall, the US economy is doing pretty well. And then one thing where the EU really stands out is in terms of its position in global trade. The EU is by far the biggest trade actor in the world. It accounts for the biggest share of trade in goods and services. And that's really important when it comes to the EU negotiating with China or the United States on trade issues. So it's really unfortunate that Britain's not going to be part of that anymore. So one thing to just quickly remember is that in spite of all of the problems and the questions and the difficulties, the EU does continue to function quite well. One of the most important things it's got going for it is the euro. So the dark blue countries are the countries which have adopted the euro. The other countries, excluding Britain, obviously now, because this map is now a little bit out of date, most of the other countries that are in the EU have agreed to adopt the euro at some point in the future. The only exception to that is Denmark, which has said it will not adopt the euro at all. This is a €1 coin, which is kind of ironic because there's the UK right in the middle. So I don't know if they're going to change the design of that and blot out the UK as a result of it having left. In terms of the impact of Brexit on the United Kingdom, lots of questions are asked about whether the UK can continue to exist in its current form. Now, if you're familiar with the way the UK is set up, and it does confuse a lot of people, the UK is actually 3.5 countries in one. So it's England, Scotland, Wales, and then Northern Ireland. And Northern Ireland is the result of a partition that took place when the Republic of Ireland became independent back in the 1920s. And people in Northern Ireland who are primarily Protestants decided they didn't want to be part of a Catholic Ireland, so the country was split in two. So one of the biggest questions at the moment is that this border here between Northern Ireland and Ireland virtually doesn't exist. It did exist for a long time. And this caused a number of problems. One of the effects of the peace treaty that was signed in Northern Ireland, because again, if you remember your history, they had essentially a civil war in Northern Ireland from the 1970s to the 1990s. And one of the effects of the peace treaty that was signed was that to all intents and purposes, the border would disappear. So if you cross the border from Northern Ireland into the Republic, there'll be a sign saying, welcome to Ireland or welcome to Northern Ireland. But there's no roadblocks, there's no customs and immigration, there's absolutely nothing. And there's a concern now that this border, which used to be an internal border of the European Union, is now an external border. And what are they going to do to make the distinction of this border right here without recreating the stresses that led partly to what are called the Troubles back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So this is a problem which has not been resolved and potentially could cause quite a few problems in the future. And then the other big question is Scottish independence. So in 2014, there was a referendum on Scottish independence, and it was pretty convincingly defeated. 55% of people said no, and 45% said yes. But then the Brexit referendum came along, and you saw this huge division in the way people voted, and this enormous support in Scotland for remaining part of the European Union. And so there's been a revisiting of the referendum, and more pressure now to have a second referendum at some point in the not too distant future, where according to polls, and this is where the polls are heading at the moment, it's quite likely that if they do have this referendum, and by the way, it's certainly not clear that they will have a referendum, because there's all sorts of legal complications and political complications. But this is where the polls are headed. So for the longest time, people who were opposed to independence had a plurality, certainly, but had a majority for a little bit in there. And now things have flipped slightly. I mean, the gap has closed a little bit right there. But you can see now that there is a plurality in favor of independence. The number of people who want independence now outnumber the number of people who want to remain part of the UK. So if things continue in this direction, one of the possibilities is that the United Kingdom will cease to be. And this is just a map that I found on the internet. I have no idea who drew it up, and my apologies for stealing it off the internet, but it's kind of interesting. So this is somebody's speculation about what could happen if things head the same way they are now. So what could happen is that you have the reunification of Ireland over here, at which point Northern Ireland would go back into the European Union because it now becomes a member of a country that is in the EU. You have the independence of Scotland, which would then most likely immediately apply for membership of the EU. And if that happened, it would probably get in fairly quickly, because for decades it was a member, so making the transition would not be that difficult. And then that would leave the English and the Welsh to set up their own new United Kingdom of England and Wales. And somebody came up with this combined flag here, the English flag and the Welsh flag. So, you know, there's some possibilities there, but these speculations at the moment are fairly dangerous, but lots and lots of questions. And certainly the whole Brexit issue has not been settled by any means. And at that point, I will stop and look forward to our conversation about Brexit.
I'm not, oh, okay, am I unmuted now? All right.
Yes, yeah, I can hear you, Ray. Yeah.
Okay, great. All right, well, thank you, John, very much. That was a very interesting presentation, and kind of reminded us of some things we might have known before, and some new facts that really help us understand what's going on there. If you have a question, please send it to me. If you want to ask the question yourself, just write a little note and say, I'd like to ask a question. I will take the first question for myself, actually, if that's okay. So is the UK right now a declining population country? And if it is, what does that say about their need for immigration? And, you know, because immigration was part of the concern for voting to exit. And kind of a side question on that, what is the relationship between England and India with respect to immigration?
The UK is not a declining population country. No, its population has been growing pretty steadily for many, many years. As I said, it's around about 60 million at the moment. So a lot of the numbers were accounted for by immigration. from other parts of the European Union. For example, there was a time when a lot of people were coming from Poland, like moving to the UK and setting up businesses. And there was a time when I went back a few times to the UK, and it seemed like almost every restaurant I went to was owned by someone from Poland. The relationship with India, I don't know. There are a lot of people of Indian extraction in the UK, but most of those didn't actually come from India. They came from places like Kenya and Uganda back in the 1970s, when the governments of those countries made it very difficult for those people to stay there. And many of them already had a claim to British citizenship, so they moved to the UK. So the biggest minorities in the UK are people from the Indian subcontinent, but not necessarily from actually the Indian subcontinent, from other parts of the world where Indians have lived. A lot of Pakistanis, a lot of people from the Caribbean, but also increasingly more people from parts of sub-Saharan Africa, a lot more Nigerians, for example. I think the total ethnic minority population is around about 6% of the total population.
Okay, thank you. Again, if you'd like to ask a question yourself, just let me know. There was a question here from Karina Gonzalez.
Ray, can I interject real quick? Can we ask the speaker if we can please stop sharing so we can see the gallery? Would that be okay? Unless we need to keep this map up.
I think you did.
Sure, no problem.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, thank you.
Yep.
All right.
Yeah.
So where was I here? Oh, Karina Gonzalez had a question. Her question was, what is the US-UK trading relationship going to look like?
We are very big trading partners, have been for a long time, will continue to be. I mean, the UK invests a huge amount of money into this country. The United States invests a significant amount of money into the UK. The only unknowable at the moment is the terms of the trading relationship, because until the UK left the EU, the terms were set by the trade agreement between the EU and the United States. Now that Britain is outside the European Union, it can continue to function on the basis of some elements of the trade agreement, but it has to renegotiate its separate trade agreement with the United States. And that's been one of the promises that people like Boris Johnson have made, is that, oh, it's not a problem. We have this historical special relationship and we'll get it all sorted out and we'll all be so much better off as a result of this. Well, we'll just have to wait and see whether that is in fact the case.
Okay.
Sorry, I just have to note, I see my neighbor, Dennis, there. Dennis, I didn't know that you were part of the group here. Good to see you.
Dennis,
likewise.
Dennis, did you have a question? I see your name up here.
Yes, actually.
I don't think I'm your neighbor, but I'm your neighbor on the screen, I guess. I'm wondering how Boris Johnson is thought of as it relates to COVID. Since the EU didn't do very well, how did Britain do?
Britain's actually done relatively quite well, which is also ironic given that Boris Johnson himself contracted COVID last year. No, this is one area where I think his government will probably exploit the situation and say, look, this is one of the benefits of not being part of the EU, is that we were able to institute lockdowns that were a bit more effective, and then we were able to get distribution of vaccines that was more effective than the rest of the EU.
Yeah. I have a second question related to immigration. I understand if you drill down into the populace in Great Britain, immigration was really a big issue as to the outcome of that vote. Do you concur with that?
No, that's absolutely right. It was one of the concerns that was broadcast about, if we remain part of the EU, then we are subject to European Union policy on immigration and we can't control it.
Yeah.
But if we leave the European Union, then that gives us much more independence to set the terms of immigration to the UK. But again, like so many things, everything is complicated now by COVID. So we'll have to wait and see exactly how that works out.
Okay, thank you.
So,
Dennis Epperling, you want to try again there? Next question?
Okay, yes, and welcome to my neighbor here. I'm new to the group this evening, so I'm just sitting in a little bit to learn. But John, as you reflect on the EU and UK divide, you mentioned early on, you might say some of the frustration where the EU is becoming maybe too bureaucratic, asking for money and things like that. Can you elaborate a little bit more? Because the sense was at that time where a lot of the country just frustrated, the EU is asking for more money, imposing more regulations, it just really drove a frustration level. And you say maybe correlated some things in the US, but just elaborate a little bit more about the history and perspective there maybe.
well, the EU wasn't in a position to ask for more money. The amount of money that was given to the EU in the EU budget is determined by an agreement among the member states. So they develop a budget. It used to be an annual budget, and they've now got it onto a 7-year cycle, I think it is. But that determines the amounts that are given by each of the member states to the central budget, and then where's that money spent? So the EU wasn't asking for more. It was collectively agreeing that it was worth spending money on various policies and various initiatives, and that this money had to be raised. There is a limit. Off the top of my head, I forget how much it is. It's something like 2.1% or something of GNP is the limit as to how much money countries would pay into the EU. So it's actually very small. In terms of bureaucracy, it all depends on your philosophy or your position, I suppose, about the value of multinational regulation. And yes, a lot of people like to complain about the requirements of European Union law in addition to national law. But I would argue that in many ways, European Union regulation made things a lot easier because it harmonized things. So all 28 countries were operating on the same basis. To some extent, they were being pulled up by the leaders. So one of my areas is environmental policy, for example. And in that area, the EU has actually collectively done better in terms of setting goals on things like air pollution standards and water quality standards than if the member states had gone their own separate ways. So I would argue that in many ways, European Union regulation has actually been a benefit rather than acting as a drag on people's freedoms and sovereignty.
All right, thanks. So Mark Cooper has a question.
Thank you very much, Ray. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. So my question is about the Privacy Shield and GDPR. I'm just curious about your impressions on how that's going to change now that the UK is not a part of the EU. How will they look at the privacy issues? And then you alluded to this, but I'd like your impressions on the border, actual transactional nature of the hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. How's that going to impact actual trade? Because I've heard, I've not seen it, but I'm looking for it, the actual documentation between the parties vis-a-vis the Schengen Agreement of the past.
Sorry, how's it going to impact trade between who and who?
Well, between the UK and the rest of the EU, but also Northern Ireland and the other part of Ireland. So both pieces, because if you have to have a document to share, to bring your trucks across or to do anything like this, how is that going to impact this? And there's not a free flow of goods and people.
Well, I don't know. This is also kind of above my pay grade in terms of understanding the dynamics of this. They haven't reached an agreement. And this has been one of the most troubling parts of the terms of the UK leaving the European Union is what to do with this border, because by all rights, it needs to be a hard border with customs and immigration, and then a rescinding of many of the regulations that governed trade between Northern Ireland and the Republic. The problem is that many people in Northern Ireland and Republic do not want the hard border. They want to retain that soft border. So the last thing I heard is they were trying to come up with a way of keeping the soft border physically, but somehow working around this in terms of the regulations that applied to trade across that border. Now, I have no idea at all how that's going to work in practice. And it has been, I mean, if I could, I mean, I can't answer that question, and people who are much more authoritative and involved in these kinds of things, they can't come up with an answer either. It's just been that sort of problem that doesn't seem to have an answer at this point. One thing that's becoming as a matter of concern is that there are signs of increased violence in Northern Ireland, and there are signs of increased tensions, and we just have to worry that that does not get any worse than it is now.
The second issue I had to quiz you about was just the privacy issue of privacy issues that are general in the EU. And as I know right now, I think the UK is still following the Privacy Shield and the GDPR rules. But it's going to be interesting, and I'd just like your opinion. Are they going to stick with that, go out on their own, or is there, you know, the issue of data being the new oil?
I would speculate that the UK is so heavily invested in so many different ways in the rest of the European Union that to a large extent, it's going to have to follow the lead of the EU, and it's not going to be in the position to really be able to negotiate. And you already see that with places like Norway and Switzerland, which are right on the border and trade and are invested in the rest of the EU. And to a large extent, they have to go along with the rest of the EU, and they're not really in a position to negotiate separately because they're in kind of a position of weakness. And just to give you an example from environmental policy, the European Union has this program called REACH, which is aimed at chemicals. Any new chemicals which are proposed to be put onto the market in the European Union have to go through this rigorous process of being inspected and tested for all of the possible effects they might have, negative effects they might have on people and the environment. Now, we have some chemical regulation in this country, but it's a lot weaker than is the case with the European Union. Any chemicals that any American chemical manufacturer wants to sell to the European market, they have to go through this same program. And there's been a lot of resistance and a lot of concern in this country about the additional cost of meeting European Union standards. And the EU response has been, well, if you want to sell these chemicals in our market, you have to live by our rules. So if they can do something like that with the United States, then they can certainly do things like that with the UK, even though it's on a much broader scale, that relationship with the UK.
It's sort of like the CE mark, same issue.
Yep. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. There was actually a data question somebody had. They were kind of interested in the relative population of Scotland, England, and Wales and Ireland.
Well, the total population is 60. Scotland, I think, is 6. Northern Ireland is around about 3, maybe. Wales, maybe about 3. I'm guessing a little bit here. England definitely dominates. I think England is up in the 40s somewhere. So in terms of population, England is definitely the major actor in the relationship.
Kind of a related question to that was, is most of the immigration into England?
Probably, yes. A lot of immigrants tend to go to the big cities, right? Much the same as with us. They go to London, Birmingham, places like that. But then, you know, Scotland has got Glasgow and, well, Glasgow primarily. I would think most of the immigration is, yes, into England.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Bruce Frank, you got a question you want to ask? Bruce has several questions here. I'll see if he can limit it to just 1 or 2. You out there, Bruce? Yo, Bruce. Oh.
This has presented a huge issue with Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland and Ireland in terms of straightening out perhaps an artificial alignment of nations in power. With the Scotland overwhelmingly voting to leave, or not to leave, and England voting to leave, and then Northern Ireland now, and that you acknowledged it as well. I can't figure out where the border is between England, Northern Ireland, Ireland, and the EU. Might this push the whole thing towards a UK just dissolving? into independent nations as it was 500 years ago?
Yes, I mean, that last map that I showed there, which somebody kindly put on the internet, shows one possible scenario where Ireland reunites with Northern Ireland, so it becomes what it was before partition. And then you got the possibility of Scotland becoming independent. So yes, absolutely. The UK could.
That will happen?
It's possible. Whether it's probable, I don't know. I mean, those polls that I showed you on Scotland seem to suggest that some people in Scotland are changing their mind.
Yeah.
And they already had a little bit of a dry run in 2014 when they really had to think, okay, well, now we're going to have to vote on this. So it's not just speculation. We're actually going to have to really think hard about this. So they've been through that. Now, if they have another referendum, they do so from the point of view where Scotland is no longer part of the EU, the whole balance of the conversation has changed.
Well, the whole premise of England leaving the EU is to retain their sovereignty. If that's the premise that England believes in, then Scotland should leave the United Kingdom.
Yes, you could say that. Yeah, yeah. They're hoisted with their own petard, as Shakespeare would have said.
Okay, Sharon Sullivan had a question here. Oh, by the way, you couldn't think of the name of the drug. It's AstraZeneca.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Yep.
It occurred to me as you were talking there. Anyhow, Sharon wanted to know about London as a financial center, and I actually had the same question. There was an article in the New York Times this morning about that, or yesterday, relative to the declining role of London as a financial center. What is your kind of opinion about that?
Well, that's a concern that people in London have. I mean, preparatory to the agreement coming into force, whatever agreement it was, after the Brexit vote, but before the UK actually left, companies were moving, international companies multinational companies were moving out of London and were moving to Paris and to Frankfurt and places like that. Now, I don't know how much of a job drain there was, but London outside the EU is not as attractive as London inside the EU for sure. But then these financial folks are extremely creative. And I'm sure that there's lots of ways in which things are being done to try and get around some of the difficulties. And the UK still does have an advantage of being an English-speaking country in Europe, which is an advantage that Ireland has used to its benefit as well. So foreign companies, say from the US or other countries where English is the primary language of commerce, at least, London remains very attractive still. And it's got the infrastructure and it's got the networks and everything else set up. It doesn't, then other cities to some extent would have to kind of reinvent the wheel to achieve that kind of position within finance that London has. I actually saw, there was one time I saw a story that was written, and it was, I don't know how serious the author was. They talked about the possibility of London becoming a special administrative area within the UK, kind of like Hong Kong. So London would have this different kind of relationship with the rest of the European Union, but still be part of the UK, which is an interesting thought.
Right.
So I'm not sure if this question was meant seriously or facetiously, but someone asked whether Steve Bannon had anything to do with Brexit.
I wouldn't be surprised.
So another question is, I'm really curious about this, more about the immigration concerns. Is the same level of overt racism apparent in large cities in England or in Great Britain as we have in the United States? Or,
yep, you know? Yep, very similar problems, similar causes. Sort of tied into that, you have the appeal of populism. There was a sort of a Donald Trump equivalent man called Nigel Farage, who's not as active now as he used to be. There's nationalism. There's English nationalism, where there's a sentiment within England of, okay, the Scots want to leave and the Northern Irish want to leave. Let's leave first. Let's preempt them so we can divorce them before they can divorce us. And they're definitely, the English nationalism was definitely part of the conversation about Brexit. Yep.
Okay. Nick Idy, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. You have a question?
Yeah, I'd like ride without the R.
Okay, sorry.
No problem. Yeah, I have this, I came across this interesting Venn diagram several years ago that shows all these different European supranational organizations. There's obviously the EU, but also things like European Economic Area and the European Free Trade Association. And, you know, the economic area is all the EU members plus Iceland, Norway, Liechtenstein, and then Switzerland is in EFTA, again, with those three countries. I'm wondering, you know, maybe would the UK or England, whatever it ends up being, maybe transition to a status similar to, like, say, a Norway or a Switzerland in terms of its relationship with the European Union, in respect with, you know, some of these other supranational European organizations?
No, sure, absolutely. There's been a lot of different models talked about regarding the future British relationship with the EU. The Norway model, the Canada model, which I've never really understood, but it's out there as part of the conversation. Britain actually was one of the founding members of the European Free Trade Association, EFTA, back in the 1950s, when the European Economic Community was just in its formative years. Britain decided that they didn't really like elements of the communities. They set up an alternative club, the European Free Trade Association, which involved the UK plus most of the Scandinavian countries, plus Switzerland, plus Liechtenstein. And one of my thoughts was when they left, they might sort of reapply for membership of EFTA because it still exists. But I've not heard anything more about that. They could be part of the European Economic Area because that involves European Union countries and non-EU countries. And the terms of membership there are that if you're not in the EU, but you're part of the European Economic Area, you have to agree to all the terms set by the European Union. So it's sort of it's like a waiting, not a waiting room, but it's like a separate entity, but right next to the European Union, where you get most of the benefits of the European single market, but you have no decision-making power, or you can't participate in that process. So yeah, there are multiple overlapping institutions. The Council of Europe is another big one, but that focuses on human rights. That has 44 member countries, including Russia.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Kind of a follow-up question to some of the issues about Scotland and Ireland. And you were not shy about expressing your opinion about Brexit. What would your opinion be about whether it be practical or a smart thing for Ireland and Scotland to separate from England, from Great Britain?
Northern Ireland is complicated because you've got the Protestant Catholic division within Northern Ireland. And it used to be primarily an economic division. So Catholics were poorer, Protestants were wealthier. That has changed. The balance has changed. The population balance has changed. It used to be 60-40 Protestant Catholic. It's more like 50-50 now. Ireland itself is one of the most successful countries in the world. Its economy has been growing in leaps and bounds. So any concerns that Protestants might have about joining a poor country to the south, that no longer is true. So at the end of the day, it all comes down to sort of a cultural / religious division and the extent to which Protestants and Catholics can live with each other without killing each other. And that has changed. Back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, it was completely different. I went to Northern Ireland a couple of times, and it was sort of like walking between West Berlin and East Berlin. I mean, you were walking from one very tribal neighborhood into another very tribal neighborhood. So that's changed. In terms of Scotland, Scotland actually benefits a lot from being part of the UK. They get a lot of subsidies and investments from the UK. On a per capita basis, they are significantly overrepresented in the British Parliament compared to people in England. Scotland used to have oil, but the oil is slowly depleting. When the oil was discovered back in the 1960s and 1970s, that's when they first had a vote on independence. And people thought, well, Scotland can now become established as a separate a country. It was viable, but it didn't happen. I wouldn't blame the Scots at all. At the last referendum, I was very much hoping that they would stay together, you know, just for nostalgia, if nothing else. And surely it's better for countries to be together than separate. But honestly, I think the way that England has gone ahead and gone off on its own direction with Brexit, I would not be, I would be sympathetic to the Scottish cause right now.
So if you were to guess, if the election were held today, the referendum were held today, what would happen?
I haven't seen any polls recently.
I'm talking about Brexit in general, not Scotland.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, just after Brexit, in the couple of years after Brexit, the polls seem to suggest that a lot of people who voted for Brexit were changing their minds. And so there was speculation that if another referendum was held, that the Remainers might actually win. So I haven't seen polls recently, but that was a trend that was happening at that point. So we're talking a couple of years ago.
So what is the kind of relationship with Great Britain? There's a question here from Sharon. Leaving, any impact on the Commonwealth? You know, the more expansive parts of the British Empire? Yeah,
no, because that's something which the UK is a member of, completely independent from the rest of Europe. So no, that wouldn't change. The domestic politics of the UK is not going to change. Somebody was asking me last week, is it going to have an impact on the British monarchy? No, no impact on that at all.
So the monarchy is kind of neutral on this whole?
Well, I don't know, because there was a very famous picture taken of Queen Elizabeth about 3 years ago where she was giving a speech to Parliament, and she was dressed in a kind of a blue outfit that was very similar to the color of the EU flag. And she had a hat which had 12 little yellow dots on it. And people were looking at this and saying, is she making a political statement here? Because she's not allowed to make political statement. Mm-hmm. Or is this just purely accidental? And then on that note, not long after, when Donald Trump made his state visit to London, she was photographed welcoming President Trump and his wife, and she was wearing a brooch that Michelle Obama had given her. Was that accidental, or was she making a political statement? We'll never know.
Funny. I think Britain has recently indicated they're going to update their nuclear capabilities. Does this have anything to do with this whole Brexit situation?
That I don't know, but they don't really control their nuclear weapons. The United States controls them. Mm-hmm. So I don't know what they mean by updating. They are spending more on defense, that's for sure, but they'd started doing that before Brexit. Honestly, they don't really have an independent nuclear force, not like the French.
Okay. All right, I think we're about out of questions here. Betty, do you have any comments you want to close us out with here?
Thank you. Except that if we have come to our nightcap time, that's wonderful. I think that, John, you're speaking to England in an area that I think many Americans identify with. I think much of our ancestry comes from that particular part of the world. And if nothing else, we probably have paid closer attention to that then we would probably understand most other parts of Europe and certainly the rest of the world. So I want to thank you very much for your presentation this evening. It was a great topic to end our year with. And I feel a little sad. There's such a, great decisions comes just almost one week after the other, and there's a lot of intensity. I have to say that there's quite a bit of planning that goes into these. We usually start by midsummer because we begin to get our topics for the next year from the Foreign Policy Association, and then the task begins to find really the best speakers we can and putting this all together, and then it comes in a well swoop and it's very intense and then it's over. So we have very much enjoyed you. Some of the names as I look across, I see you have joined us practically every single topic, and I want to thank you. I thank you for your loyalty. Please don't forget that we welcome, if you've given a donation for this evening, thank you very much. We do need that. It may look like being Zoom or what have you, we don't have costs. We do have costs. We have costs for everything that goes into what we do. And we're also into a lot of expansion. We have an increasing number of students who want to take advantage of the opportunities that we're offering, not only their ability to participate with this, but schools would like to participate more, and also through Academic World Quest. The Indiana Council of World Affairs is not just one thing or the other. It's all that we do in our mission to keep you informed. And with that, I want to say, please stay on. Go to your logger. I'm going to go to mine. I have a glass of first chilled white wine that's waiting for me. So we're going to just take a couple of minutes. I know our speaker has expressed his desire to go to his logger. So we're going to take just a moment to do that. And if you'd like to leave us, fine. Again, I hate to say goodbye to all of you who are leaving, to any of you. It's been a wonderful program year, and I want to thank you for your tremendous support. I know our committee has been thrilled with the outcome of this year and the speaker. Thank you, Janet. Oh, thank you. I bow to all of you. It's been a wonderful year, and you've given us quite a lift. We'll see what next year brings. Hey, you know, will we be live? Well, we're going to be a combination of both because we've liked it. We just have to figure out how we're going to do that.